if you've got a potential ally in the form of Cuba that sits so close to the US mainland, you're going to take advantage of it. It gives the Chinese eyes and ears on US military maneuverings. That would, of course, be an immediate red flag to the Americans. China has had a long-standing kind of spy base, is the best word to term it, outside Havana, because it's a very valuable place in order to spy on US ships, naval traffic, but also things like space launches, and indeed even to penetrate US military bases in the southeastern tip of the US, because of course Cuba is so close to the US, you can pick up these things. That's been building this since 1999. It seems to be very advanced in terms of its electronic abilities now. The fear, of course, is that not only is China gathering significant amounts of electronic intelligence on the US from this base, but it is also able to potentially intervene should there ever be a conflict between the US and Cuba by aiming at electronic interference of US advancing vessels, which of course require the US to essentially take it out should they be planning such an operation themselves. So it does run the risk, of course, of creating a bit of a flashpoint between the two superpowers.
Reports are saying the base has a 5,000-mile spy radius. What can the Chinese actually see and hear from this base?
Well, from the base, if you have a 5,000 mile spy radius, you can firstly interdict traffic that is traveling around the Caribbean, of course. And if you think the US, of course, has got significant naval assets there, I mean, fairly recently, of course, the US amassed a very significant naval flotilla, as it were, near Venezuela in order to see, to help topple that regime. So the Chinese are obviously observing what the US is doing in its own backyard in the Western Hemisphere. But it can go further than that. It can track space launches from Cape Canaveral, which is, of course, in Florida. It can look at the naval bases and the army bases in Florida, of which there are quite significant numbers, to see basically what might be happening there. But of course, it can go even further than Florida, given the scale of its, the approach, and cover a significant amount of the continental US as well. Basically, it gives the Chinese eyes and ears on US military maneuverings, and potentially not simply military maneuverings, other aspects as well of US civilian life the Chinese might have interest in learning more about.
We're hearing reports of underground spy cities and bunkers, and China has poured a lot of money into this base. How nefarious is all of this activity?
Well, all of this makes sense from a Chinese perspective. If you've got a potential ally in the form of Cuba that sits so close to the US mainland, you're going to take advantage of it. It's similar to what the Soviets did during the Cold War, of course. And given that they had a similar base, which was designed to act as forward warning for them about activities that the US might be engaged in during the Cold War as well. So it's a long established principle to use a hostile state to the US near the US in order to give yourself some intelligence advantage in any either conflict with the US or simply in any dealings with the US, because you'll have a better sense of how the US is operating within the frame of reference of your intelligence operations. So all of this is valuable information for the Chinese, and of course it is nefarious because the Chinese will not be using this for beneficial purposes, but to try and either understand the US better or stop the US in the event of a conflict of some kind for China's own advantage.
Cuba's economy is in ruins. There's the oil blockade. People are lacking food and medicine. Where is the money coming to build and maintain this multi-million-dollar high-tech spy hub?
Well, the Chinese are obviously the suppliers of the spy hub, both technology and indeed the finance to keep it going. The Cubans do not have the money, given their current parlous financial status, to be able to do this themselves. So it's heavily dependent on the Chinese, just as in the Cold War, it was heavily dependent on the Soviets to deliver, the control of the intelligence bases that they were using then. So we have to assume the Chinese are putting in significant amounts of money in order to boost their own intelligence gathering purposes, so that they can learn more about American activity and intentions in the Western Hemisphere, but also potentially understanding how they might act beyond that through training exercises and other things that they could spy on as well.
The US Central Command, CENTCOM, is based in the southeastern of the US, right in this base's crosshairs. How vulnerable is how vulnerable is the US Global Military Command to this setup? And do the is the military still operating in a centralized way? Is it not dispersed for security?
Well, the US will obviously be aware of this base and will have its own measures in place to deflect from this. I mean, the if you think about the whole history again of espionage operations between countries, is that they try and break into what you're doing and you're trying to stop them. So the Americans aren't just sitting there going, let's get on with our activities, and the Chinese will pick all this up without any operation. The Americans will be seeking to obscure what they're doing, having their own anti sort of spy measures in place to restrict the Chinese ability to monitor what they're doing, and indeed to sort of maybe even give some false information, misinformation to the Chinese in order to confuse them about what the Americans might actually be up to. So it's a constant game of cat and mouse between countries in this respect. And so, although of course this base is a problem, it is nothing the Americans haven't dealt with before, and it is telling that the fact that the base has been in operation for a number of years, it's been around since 1999, clearly if the Americans thought it was a real material threat to what they felt were their key national security interests, they'd have acted to close it down already. So, yes, the Chinese are constantly upscaling, the Americans are upscaling their defenses as well. The only issue might be, should the Americans decide that they wanted to topple the Cuban regime finally, how would the Chinese involvement in that play out, particularly in the role of this base in potentially jamming signals between US attacking forces?
Yeah, Donald Trump had Donald Trump had success with Venezuela. If he decides to act on Cuba, how likely is a US military strike on Cuban soil to take these out?
Well, it depends, of course, on the nature of what the US might be thinking of doing. Let's not forget, in Venezuela, it wasn't actually a full-scale invasion. It was a simple smash and grab operation. I mean, not simple; it was very complicated, but a very successful smash and grab operation, which just aimed to defenestrate the regime at the top level. So, if it was a full-scale invasion of Cuba, which I think is unlikely, to be entirely honest, then yes, it would have to take this base out. And that, of course, runs a risk of some kind of conflict between the US and China over this base's presence. But there are other things the Americans could, of course, do without having to attack the base. They could cut off its electricity supply, which would be just as effective. They could work out a way of screening and shielding it. I think the lessons of recent American special force operations are, don't bet against the Americans in terms of coming up with novel ways to blind the enemy and to make what you're doing invisible to their activity. I mean, Venezuela was fairly well defended. This wasn't a walk in the park. They had to undertake some pretty significant activities. The same, of course, has been true in Iran when it's come to strikes against regime targets. So yes, you might have to take the base out, but there are probably creative ways of doing it, which doesn't rely upon a US-China, kind of conflict that could get very nasty.
In 2016, Marco Rubio called for Cuba to kick China out. Why have successive US administrations seemingly ignored this threat for decades?
Well, for a long time, of course, Cuba had some kind of international support from allied countries that kept it going. So as a result, it looked very difficult for the Americans to take action. At one point, the Russians, the Chinese, the Venezuelans were all capable of providing some kind of support to Cuba. So while it would have been nice to have kicked all these, kind of bases out, the costs of action for the US might have been harder than what they were prepared to bear. What's happened in recent years, of course, is that the strategic situation has changed dramatically. The Venezuelans are out of the game. They are no longer supporting the Cubans. As a result, that's weakened the Cuban economy. The Russians have no capacity to support the Cubans either, given their own conflict in Ukraine, sapping all of their strength. And yes, the Chinese are engaged, but whether the Chinese would actually want to actually, sort of get hot engaged with the Americans on Cuba, that seems to be very unlikely. So, because the circumstances have changed, the Americans have seen an opportunity now to apply significant pressure to Cuba. And I must stress the aim here would not be a military invasion. The aim would be an economic, and is an economic blockade, essentially, to collapse the regime through its own inability to provide for the people of Cuba. And that seems to be some way down the line already. So it's not clear by any means the Americans would need to engage in a sort of military conflict in order to take the Cubans out. And therefore, even now, even with all these warnings, that it might not be required for the Americans to actually take action against this base or against Cuba.
Um, Looking ahead over the next 5 to 10 years, do you see Cuba becoming the center of a second Cuban Missile Crisis style standoff between Washington and Beijing, or will it finally submit and become a capitalist pro-Western state?
Well, the collapse of the communist regime in Cuba is the most likely outcome, given the pressure that's being exerted against it and the inability of anyone to come to Cuba's aid, really, and support the regime. I mean, the reason the communist regime has survived all this time is because of vast external aid. First from the Soviets, then from the Russians, Chinese, and Venezuelans. And, it's always relied on external aid to keep it going. Without that external aid, it's difficult to see how economically it can keep going. It doesn't produce very much. It is not productive. The communist system has enfeebled the Cuban economy, not benefited it. It seems that there's a time span on this regime which has probably passed its expiry date already. So the likelihood is that it will collapse with its own contradictions and the pressure that's being exerted upon it. And it is highly unlikely that you're going to see the Chinese shipping nuclear material to Cuba in the way the Soviets did the 1962 crisis, because that would, of course, be an immediate red flag to the Americans. And of course, the Americans would know about it before it would even be happening. So it's not like, I mean, the whole thing about the Cuban Missile Crisis was that the Americans found out about it, only when they started overflying Cuba with a U-2 spy plane, which just came into commission 1 or 2 years beforehand. So had they not had that capability, they'd never have known the Russians would have had, Soviets would have had nuclear missiles on Cuba in the first place. So it seems unlikely the Chinese are going to be able to ship things in, or would even want to ship things in. The obvious outcome here is that Cuba's communist regime finally has time called on it, and the Cuban people can return to some form of democracy and freedom, and to bring their lives into sharp relief, as opposed to enriching the Communist Party of Cuba instead.